There's nothing harder than cleaning out a father's room after you've buried him. The silence hits you first, then the smell of old leather and pipe tobacco that will never fill the air again. Ezra McClintock stood in his father's study, surrounded by a lifetime of memories he'd never been allowed to touch. Judge Thaddeus McClintock had been a hard man who built the biggest cattle empire west of the Pecos, but he'd kept his son at arm's length for 43 years. Now, as Ezra packed away dusty ledgers and old books, he found a loose floorboard. Underneath lay a bundle of letters, tiny baby shoes, and a photograph of twin boys. Only one of them looked like Ezra. Where was his brother? Why had his father hidden this secret for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany gavel sat where it had always sat, heavy as a gravestone on the corner of the massive oak desk. Judge Thaddeus McClintock had pounded that gavel for 37 years on the bench, dispensing justice with the same iron will he'd used to build the largest cattle operation in 3 counties. Now it was just another reminder that the man who'd wielded it was gone, leaving behind questions that felt heavier than all the cattle in Texas. Ezra McClintock ran his weathered fingers along the desk's edge, feeling every nick and scratch his father had made during late-night sessions reviewing ranch business. At 43, Ezra carried the lean build of a man who'd spent his life on horseback, but his eyes held the weariness of someone who'd never quite measured up to the legend he was supposed to inherit. The study felt enormous without his father's commanding presence, filling it all dark, wood paneling, leather-bound law books, and the lingering scent of Old Spice aftershave mixed with cherry pipe tobacco. Through the tall windows, he could see the rolling pastures that stretched toward the horizon like a green ocean. 15,000 head of prime Angus cattle grazed on McClintock land, tended by a crew of ranch hands who'd worked for the family longer than Ezra had been alive. This empire, built from nothing but determination and sweat, was now his responsibility. The weight of it pressed down on his shoulders like a yoke he'd never asked to wear. You planning to stand there all day, or are you going to start sorting through this mess? Rosa Delgado's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd been bossing McClintock men around for the better part of 3 decades. She stood in the doorway holding a pot of coffee and wearing the same disapproving expression she'd perfected when Ezra was 12 and tracking mud through her clean kitchen. Just thinking, Rosa. Ezra turned from the window, grateful for the interruption. Rosa had been more of a mother to him than his own had ever gotten the chance to be, and her presence always brought comfort to the cold corners of the big house. That's your problem right there. She set the coffee pot on a side table and began gathering scattered papers. Too much thinking, not enough doing. Your daddy never stood around contemplating. He saw what needed done, and he did it. There it was again, the inevitable comparison to Judge Thaddeus McClintock. Even in death, the old man cast a shadow that seemed to follow Ezra wherever he went. Everyone expected him to fill boots that felt 3 sizes too big, to make decisions with the same ruthless efficiency that had turned a struggling ranch into a cattle dynasty. Maybe that was his problem, Ezra said quietly, immediately regretting the words when he saw Rosa's sharp look. Don't you speak ill of that man, Ezra James McClintock. Whatever else he was, he loved you something fierce, just didn't know how to show it proper. Rosa's voice softened, but her eyes remained firm. Some men are better at building empires than raising sons. Doesn't mean the love wasn't there. Ezra had heard variations of this speech his entire life, but it never made the ache of his childhood feel any less real. He remembered being 8 years old, desperate for his father's approval, bringing home a straight-A report card, only to have it briefly acknowledged with a grunt and a pat on the head before his father returned to reviewing livestock breeding charts. He remembered the long summers working alongside the ranch hands, hoping his father might notice his efforts, only to be told he was in the way and sent back to the house. He had a funny way of showing love, Ezra said, picking up a framed photograph from the desk. It showed his father at some cattle auction, shaking hands with another rancher, both men grinning beneath their Stetsons. Ezra couldn't remember ever seeing that smile directed at him. The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he saw Charlie Brennan climbing the steps, his hat in his hands and his expression serious. Charlie had been the ranch foreman for 15 years, loyal as sunrise and twice as dependable. If anyone knew the true state of McClintock Cattle Company, it was Charlie. "Afternoon, Charlie," Ezra called as the foreman appeared in the study doorway. "Mr. McClintock." Charlie nodded respectfully. Though they'd known each other since Charlie was a green kid looking for work, and Ezra was still trying to prove himself worthy of his father's name. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by. Got some paperwork needs your signature, and well..." He glanced around the study. "Figured we ought to talk about what comes next." What comes next? The question Ezra had been avoiding for the 3 weeks since the funeral. Everyone assumed he'd step into his father's role, take over the day-to-day operations of the ranch, become the next generation of McClintock leadership. But Ezra had spent most of his adult life trying to escape the suffocating weight of family expectations, and now that escape felt further away than ever. "Pour yourself some coffee, Charlie." Rosa made it strong enough to wake the dead. Ezra gestured to the pot, trying to inject some lightness into the conversation. Charlie accepted the cup gratefully, settling into one of the leather chairs that faced the desk. "Cattle prices are holding steady, and we've got that contract with the processors locked in through next spring. Ranch is running smooth as silk, just like your daddy left it. But..." Ezra could hear the unasked question hanging in the air. "But the boys are getting restless. They know you've been talking to real estate agents, and rumors spread faster than wildfire in a place like this." Charlie's weathered face showed the strain of trying to hold things together. "These men have worked McClintock land their whole lives. Their daddies worked for your daddy. This place is more than just a job to them, it's home." Ezra felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation of walls closing in that had driven him to Dallas after college, seeking something his father's shadow couldn't touch. He'd built a successful consulting business, carved out his own identity away from the ranch. But even then, the pull of home had been constant, and guilt had eventually drawn him back to help with operations, though he'd never committed fully to staying. "I know what they're thinking, Charlie. But this place..." Ezra gestured around the study. "It's too big for one man. Too much history. Too many expectations. Your daddy felt the same way when his father passed," Charlie said quietly. "Old Samuel McClintock was a hard act to follow too. But Judge Thaddeus found his own way to run things, made the ranch bigger and better than it ever was. And what if I'm not built for that? What if I'm not my father?" The words came out harsher than Ezra intended, revealing more vulnerability than he'd meant to show. Charlie studied him for a long moment, then set down his coffee cup. "You know what your daddy told me the day you graduated college?" He said, "That boy's got more sense than I ever had, and twice the heart. When he's ready, he'll make this place something special." He was proud of you, Ezra, prouder than he knew how to say. The revelation hit Ezra like a physical blow. His father had never spoken those words to him directly, had never shown that pride in any way Ezra could recognize. It felt cruel to learn of his father's approval only after the man was gone, when it was too late to matter. "Then why..." Ezra's voice caught, and he had to clear his throat before continuing. "Why did he always make me feel like I wasn't enough? Because he was scared." Rosa's voice came from the doorway, where she'd been listening with the keen attention of someone who'd witnessed the McClintock family dynamics for decades. "Scared of losing you the way he lost." She stopped abruptly, her face flushing as if she'd revealed something she shouldn't have. "Lost what, Rosa?" Ezra straightened, sensing something important in her sudden silence. "Nothing, child. Just an old woman's ramblings," but her eyes avoided his, and her hands twisted nervously at her apron. Charlie glanced between them, clearly sensing the undercurrent of something bigger than ranch business. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. I'll leave those papers on the desk for when you're ready. Take your time deciding, Ezra. But don't take too long. Good men don't wait forever. And this place needs someone who cares about it. After Charlie left, Ezra turned back to Rosa, who was busying herself with unnecessary straightening of already organized bookshelves. Rosa, what did my father lose? Your daddy lost a lot of things over the years, Ezra. Dreams, mostly. Hope, sometimes. But he never lost faith that you'd find your way home when you were ready. She paused in her cleaning, her expression soft with old memories. He used to sit in that chair every evening after you moved to Dallas, staring out at the pastures and talking about when you'd come back to stay. But I never wanted this life, Ezra said, the honesty feeling like a confession. I wanted something different, something that was mine. Sometimes what we want and what we need are two different things, Rosa replied. And sometimes we don't know what we need until we're ready to receive it. She left him alone with those words, and Ezra found himself standing before the tall windows again, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. The golden light painted the pastures in warm tones, and he could see the cattle moving slowly toward the water tanks, following patterns established by generations of careful stewardship. This land held the dreams and struggles of 3 generations of McClintock men. His great-grandfather Samuel had homesteaded the original section, building a modest operation through sheer determination. His grandfather had expanded it, and his father had transformed it into an empire. Now it was Ezra's turn to decide whether that legacy would continue or whether the McClintock name would fade into history like so many other family ranches that couldn't survive the changing times. The weight of decision pressed down on him as he walked to his father's desk and sat in the leather chair that still held the impression of Thaddeus McClintock's larger frame. The judge's gavel caught the last light from the window, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. It had commanded respect in courtrooms across 3 counties, but here in the study it seemed more like a symbol of the burdens that came with power and responsibility. Ezra pulled out the contract Charlie had mentioned, scanning the figures that represented months of careful negotiation and planning. Everything was in order, just as his father had left it. The ranch could run itself for years with minimal oversight, generating enough income to support dozens of families and contribute to the local economy. But money wasn't the real question. The question was whether Ezra McClintock had the strength to become the man his father's legacy demanded, or whether he'd spend the rest of his life running from expectations he'd never asked to inherit. The loose floorboard creaked under Ezra's boot as he shifted boxes of his father's papers to the corner of the study. He'd been putting off this final task for days, but with real estate agents scheduled to tour the house next week, everything needed to be cleared and sorted. The potential buyers were a development company from Austin, eager to transform the ranch house into a luxury retreat for wealthy urbanites seeking an authentic Western experience. The irony wasn't lost on him, his father's legacy reduced to a weekend playground for people who'd never known the weight of true responsibility. As he lifted a particularly heavy box of law books, his boot caught the edge of the troublesome board. It tilted up at an angle, revealing a gap underneath that was clearly intentional. Ezra set down the box and knelt, examining the board more closely. Someone had carefully cut it to create a hidden compartment. The wood fitted so precisely that it appeared seamless when closed. His pulse quickened as he worked the board loose, revealing a space about the size of a shoebox carved into the floor joists. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, protected from moisture and time. With trembling hands, Ezra lifted it out, feeling the weight of secrets his father had literally buried beneath his feet. The oilcloth fell away to reveal a collection that made no sense in the context of the man Ezra thought he knew. There were letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, their envelopes yellowed with age and addressed in his father's younger handwriting. A pair of tiny leather shoes, so small they could only have belonged to an infant, worn soft from use. And most shocking of all, a photograph that stopped Ezra's breath completely. 2 boys, perhaps 3 years old, sat on the front steps of what looked like an earlier version of this very house. They wore identical overalls and matching serious expressions, but only one of them looked like Ezra. The other boy had darker hair, softer features, and eyes that seemed to hold a different kind of light. On the back of the photograph, written in his father's careful script, were two names, Ezra and Gabriel McClintock, age 3, Gabriel. Ezra stared at the name, trying to summon any memory of a brother, any fragment of childhood that might have included another boy. But there was nothing, only the vast emptiness where such memories should have been. How could he have forgotten a twin brother? How could his father have hidden such a fundamental truth? With shaking hands, he reached for the letters. The first envelope bore his father's name in a woman's delicate handwriting, postmarked from San Antonio and dated nearly 40 years ago. Inside, he found pages covered in the same careful script. "My dearest Thaddeus, I know you believe this is for the best, but my heart breaks a little more each day without them. The doctors say Gabriel is responding well to the treatments, but he asks for his brother constantly. How do I explain that Ezra is gone when I don't understand it myself? You say it's to protect Ezra from seeing his brother suffer, but children are stronger than we give them credit for. They should be together." Ezra's hands trembled as he read. His mother, the woman who had died when he was 5, whose memory his father rarely spoke of, had written these words. And she'd written about Gabriel as if he were still alive, as if there had been treatments, as if Ezra had been deliberately separated from his twin. The next letter was dated 6 months later, the handwriting more desperate. "The fire was an accident, Thaddeus. You must believe that. Gabriel didn't mean to knock over the lamp. He was only trying to read the book Ezra had left behind, the one with pictures of horses. The doctors say the burns will heal, but the infection, please, let me bring him home to recover. Let the boys see each other. This separation is killing them both." Ezra dropped the letter as if it had caught fire. Gabriel had been burned. There had been an accident, treatments, a separation that his parents had orchestrated, and somehow all memory of it had been erased from his mind so completely that he'd lived 43 years believing he was an only child. He grabbed another letter, this one dated a full year later. "I understand your decision, but I cannot live with it. Gabriel needs his family, not institutions and specialists. When you read this, I will be gone. I'm taking him home to my sister in San Antonio. Perhaps away from this place of sorrow, we can both heal. I pray someday you'll forgive me, and that Ezra will forgive us both for the choices we made in love and fear." The final letter was different, a telegram, yellow with age, dated just 2 weeks after the previous letter. "Regret to inform, stop automobile accident outside. Kerrville, stop Elizabeth and Gabriel McClintock. Deceased, stop funeral arrangements pending, stop." The papers slipped from Ezra's numb fingers, scattering across the floor like the fragments of his shattered understanding. His mother hadn't died of cancer, as his father had always told him. She had taken Gabriel, his twin brother, and left, only to die in a car accident while fleeing the pain of impossible choices. And Ezra had been left behind, his memories somehow sealed away from the trauma of loss and separation. He sat back on his heels, struggling to process revelations that rewrote the entire foundation of his life. The lonely childhood he'd attributed to his father's emotional distance now took on a different meaning. Perhaps Thaddeus McClintock hadn't been cold by nature, but broken by grief, mourning not just a wife and son, but the terrible decision to separate twin brothers for reasons that had seemed logical at the time, but had ultimately destroyed his family. Rosa's earlier words echoed in his memory. "He was scared of losing you the way he lost." She had known. Of course she had known. Rosa had been there through it all, had watched his father carry this crushing secret for nearly 4 decades. Ezra gathered the letters with reverent care, his mind racing with questions that could never be fully answered. Why had Gabriel needed treatments? What kind of accident had required such drastic intervention? And most troubling of all, How had his own memories been so thoroughly erased? He remembered fragments now, pieces that had never made sense before. Dreams of playing with another boy, conversations with an imaginary friend his father had seemed unusually disturbed by, moments of inexplicable sadness that had no apparent cause. What he'd dismissed as childhood fantasies might have been the ghost of Gabriel, his mind's attempt to hold on to what had been deliberately taken away. The tiny shoes felt impossibly delicate in his large hands. Had these belonged to Gabriel? Were they the last tangible reminder of a brother who had existed for only 3 brief years before tragedy and well-meaning decisions tore their family apart? Standing slowly, Ezra walked to the window where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. The pastures stretched endlessly toward the horizon, but they looked different now, not like the foundation of an empire, but like the stage for a tragedy that had shaped 3 generations of McClintock men. His grandfather Samuel had built this ranch, his father had expanded it, and now Ezra understood that every acre had been purchased with the pain of loss too great to bear. The judge's gavel caught his eye again, its familiar weight now carrying new meaning. How many judgments had his father rendered from the bench while carrying the knowledge that he'd made the most important decision of his life in fear and desperation? How many nights had he sat in this very study, staring at these hidden reminders of the son he'd lost and the choice that had cost him everything? Ezra carefully rewrapped the precious artifacts in their oilcloth, but he didn't return them to their hiding place. These secrets had been buried long enough. It was time to understand the full truth of what his father had carried and what it meant for the man Ezra was supposed to become. As evening settled over the ranch, he found himself thinking not about the weight of inheritance, but about the brother he'd never known he'd lost. Somewhere in the fading light, Gabriel McClintock existed only in these fragile remnants, a reminder that love sometimes makes choices that destroy the very thing it seeks to protect. The decision about the ranch suddenly seemed less important than the decision about what to do with this truth. Did he honor his father's choice to keep these secrets buried, or did he finally give voice to the grief that had shaped every day of Thaddeus McClintock's life since that terrible choice 40 years ago? Ezra barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Gabriel's face in that faded photograph, so familiar yet impossibly foreign. He'd carried the letters upstairs to his childhood bedroom, reading them over and over by lamplight, trying to piece together a story that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. By dawn, he was back in the study, spreading the contents of the hidden compartment across his father's desk like evidence at a crime scene. The morning light revealed details he'd missed in his initial shock. Gabriel's baby shoes showed uneven wear, as if one foot had dragged slightly. The photographs had water stains along the edges, suggesting they'd been handled with tears. And in his mother's letters, there were references to episodes and specialists that painted a picture of a child struggling with something more complex than a simple accident. Rosa found him there at 7 o'clock, still in yesterday's clothes and surrounded by the ghosts of his family's past. She stopped in the doorway, her weathered face going pale as she took in the scene. "Ay, Dios mío," she whispered, crossing herself. "You found them. You knew about this." It wasn't a question. Ezra's voice carried 40 years of betrayal, though he wasn't sure if his anger was directed at Rosa, his father, or the cruel arithmetic of loss that had torn his family apart. Rosa moved slowly into the room, her movements careful as if she were approaching a wounded animal. "I knew your father kept something, yes, but I never read the letters. That wasn't my place." "Your place?" Ezra laughed bitterly. "Rosa, you raised me more than either of my parents did. If anyone had a right to know the truth, it was you." She settled into the chair across from the desk, her dark eyes soft with old pain. "Your father swore me to secrecy the day I came to work here. You were 5 years old, still asking for your mama and crying for someone called Gabe in your sleep. He said forgetting was a mercy, that remembering would only bring more hurt. The name hit Ezra like a physical blow. Gabe. He'd called his brother Gabe, and somewhere deep in his subconscious, that name had echoed for 38 years. What do you remember about before? About when they were both here? Rosa's hands twisted in her lap, a gesture Ezra recognized as her way of wrestling with difficult truths. You were inseparable, you and Gabriel. Twins, but different as night and day. You were the bold one, always climbing trees and chasing cattle. Gabriel was gentler, always watching, always thinking. He had trouble with his legs, something from birth that made walking hard. But his mind... She smiled despite her tears. That boy could solve puzzles that stumped grown men. The uneven wear on Gabriel's shoes suddenly made sense. Ezra picked them up again, running his thumb over the worn leather. The letters mentioned treatments. What was wrong with him? I don't know all the medical words, Rosa said carefully. But it wasn't just his legs. Sometimes his body would shake, and he'd go somewhere else in his mind for a few minutes. The doctors in San Antonio said it was seizures, that with the right medicines he could live a normal life. But your father was ashamed. The realization came with the clarity of long-delayed understanding. Judge Thaddeus McClintock, pillar of the community and dispenser of justice, had been unable to accept a son who didn't fit his vision of McClintock's strength. Not ashamed, Rosa corrected gently. Scared. Terrified that Gabriel would suffer, that people would stare and whisper. This was 40 years ago, mijo. People didn't understand such things the way they do now. Your father thought if Gabriel could get better with treatments, then you boys could be reunited. He never meant for it to be permanent. Ezra studied his mother's photograph on the desk. Elizabeth McClintock, young and beautiful, holding both boys in her arms. In the picture, she looked tired but happy, unaware that tragedy was lurking just beyond the frame. But the fire changed everything. Gabriel was trying to light a lamp so he could look at a picture book you'd left behind. His hands shook during one of his episodes, and Rosa's voice broke. The whole room went up. The doctors said the burns would heal, but then infection set in. For weeks, it was touch and go whether he'd survive. And Mother couldn't bear to lose him. Your mother blamed herself, said if she'd been watching closer, if she hadn't let Gabriel into your room alone. Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Guilt makes people do desperate things. She thought taking Gabriel away from all the bad memories would help him heal. Ezra picked up the telegram announcing their deaths, its yellow paper brittle with age. 2 weeks. His mother and brother had been free for just 2 weeks before fate claimed them both. What about me? Did I ask for them? Did I remember? You cried for months, Rosa said softly. Your father hired doctors from Austin to help you forget. They said trauma could be treated, that young minds were resilient. They gave you medicines that made you sleep deeply, and when you woke up, the memories were... She gestured helplessly. Gone. The violation of it hit Ezra like a physical blow. His own memories, his grief, his right to mourn his brother, all of it stolen by well-meaning adults who thought they knew better. He had no right to make that choice for me. He was trying to protect you from the pain that was eating him alive, Rosa said. Was it right? I don't know, but I watched that man carry this guilt for 40 years, and it nearly killed him. Ezra stood and walked to the window, needing space to process revelations that kept reshaping his understanding of everything he'd believed about his family. In the morning light, the pastures looked the same as always, but now he wondered how many of his childhood memories were real, and how many were constructed to fill the gaps where Gabriel should have been. There's something else, Rosa said quietly. Something your father made me promise never to tell. Ezra turned back to her, not sure he could handle any more revelations. Gabriel didn't die in that car accident, Rosa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He survived for 3 days. In the hospital he kept asking for you. The nurses said his last word was, Ezra. The words hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. His brother had died calling for him, and Ezra hadn't even known Gabriel existed. The cruelty of it was almost too much to bear, a twin brother reaching out across the darkness of death for the connection that had been severed by fear and misguided love. "I need to see where they're buried," Ezra said, his voice rough with emotion. He'd been denied the right to feel for 4 decades. Rosa nodded, tears flowing freely now. "There's a small cemetery outside Kerrville. Your father visited every year on Gabriel's birthday. I have the address in my things." As Rosa left to retrieve the information, Ezra remained at the window, holding Gabriel's baby shoes and trying to imagine the brother he'd lost twice, once to medical treatments and family separation, and again to death and deliberate forgetting. The weight of inheritance no longer seemed like the heaviest burden he carried. Now he understood that some legacies were measured not in acres or cattle, but in the love that had been sacrificed on the altar of impossible choices. The drive to Kerrville took 3 hours through rolling hill country that Ezra had traveled countless times without knowing. It held the final resting place of his brother and mother. Rosa had insisted on coming along, claiming she needed to pay her respects after 40 years of carrying secrets. But Ezra suspected she was more concerned about him facing this pilgrimage alone. They rode in comfortable silence for most of the journey, the weight of revelation settling between them like a third passenger. Ezra found himself studying every detail of the landscape, wondering if his mother had seen these same oak-covered hills on her final drive, if Gabriel had pressed his small face against a car window, watching the world pass by as they fled toward what they hoped would be healing. The cemetery was smaller than Ezra had expected, nestled in a grove of ancient live oaks that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on weathered headstones. Many of the graves dated back to the 1800s, their inscriptions worn smooth by time and weather. Rosa directed him to a quiet corner where 2 modest granite markers sat beneath the spreading branches of a massive oak. Elizabeth Moreno McClintock, beloved wife and mother, 1942 to 1983. The inscription was simple, but someone had been caring for the grave. Fresh flowers, bluebonnets, and Indian paintbrush lay against the headstone, and the grass was neatly trimmed. Beside it, an even smaller marker, Gabriel Thomas McClintock, age 6, safe in the arms of angels, 1977 to 1983. Ezra stared at the dates, doing the arithmetic that revealed another layer of his father's deception. Gabriel hadn't died at 3, as the photograph had suggested. He'd lived to be 6 years old, 3 additional years that Ezra had been denied, 3 years of growth and change and possible healing that the separation had stolen from both brothers. "Your father came here every April 19th, Rosa said softly, "Gabriel's birthday. Sometimes he'd stay for hours, just sitting under this tree. I think he talked to them." Ezra knelt between the graves, running his fingers over Gabriel's name, etched in granite. The stone was warm from the afternoon sun, and he found himself imagining his brother's face at 6 instead of 3 gap-toothed grins and skinny arms, the awkward grace of childhood beginning to assert itself despite physical challenges. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a brass compass that had belonged to his father, a gift from Samuel McClintock when Thaddeus first took over ranch operations. The compass had always sat on the desk in the study, its face worn smooth by his father's nervous habit of turning it in his hands during difficult decisions. Now Ezra understood why his father had treasured it so much. It wasn't just a tool for finding direction, it was a talisman against getting lost in the wilderness of grief. "I don't know what to say to you," Ezra whispered to the graves. "I should have been here 40 years ago. I should have been with you, Gabriel, when—" His voice broke, and he had to take several deep breaths before continuing. "I'm sorry I forgot. I'm sorry Father made choices that kept us apart." A warm breeze stirred the oak leaves overhead, and for a moment Ezra could almost hear childish laughter carried on the wind. Was it memory finally surfacing, or just wishful thinking? The line between the two had blurred beyond recognition. Rosa approached quietly, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd gathered along the cemetery's edge. "I used to wonder if your father was wrong to make you forget," she said, placing the flowers on Elizabeth's grave. But seeing you now, seeing how much it hurts, even after all these years, maybe forgetting was a mercy after all." "No," Ezra said firmly. "The hurt belongs to me. Gabriel was my brother. I had a right to mourn him, to remember him, to carry him with me." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Father thought he was protecting me, but all he did was rob me of the chance to love Gabriel properly." They stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Ezra tried to imagine what his life might have been like if the separation had never happened, if Gabriel had received his treatments while remaining at home, if their mother had found the strength to hold the family together despite the challenges. Would Gabriel have grown up to work the ranch alongside him? Would they have shared the burden of their father's expectations and found strength in their twinhood? The compass needle pointed steadily north, unwavering in its purpose. Ezra realized that his father had spent 40 years traveling in circles, returning again and again to this place of loss without ever finding a way forward. The judge had dispensed justice from his bench, built an empire from nothing, commanded respect throughout 3 counties, but he'd never found peace with the choice that had defined his life. "Rosa," Ezra said suddenly, "you said father talked to them when he visited. Did he ever mention what he said?" Rosa's expression grew thoughtful. "Once, I came with him. It was maybe 10 years ago, on one of Gabriel's birthdays. I heard him telling them about you, about your business in Dallas, about how proud he was that you'd made your own way in the world. Then he said something that stayed with me all these years." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. He said, "I thought I was choosing between losing one son and losing both. I never imagined I'd end up losing all of you anyway." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. His father hadn't just lost Gabriel and Elizabeth in that car accident, he'd lost Ezra too, in a different but equally devastating way. The medical treatments that had erased Ezra's memories had also severed the deep connection between father and son, leaving them strangers, sharing a name and a legacy they could never truly discuss. Ezra placed the compass on Gabriel's headstone, its brass surface gleaming in the dappled sunlight. "I won't forget again," he promised, "and I won't let your story stay buried." As they walked back toward the car, Ezra felt something shift inside him, not healing exactly, but the beginning of understanding. The ranch he'd been so eager to sell suddenly seemed less like a burden and more like a trust. Gabriel would never see the sunsets over McClintock pastures or feel the satisfaction of honest work well done. But perhaps Ezra could honor his brother's memory by finding a way to carry both their dreams forward. The compass would stay with Gabriel, pointing north toward whatever peace the dead could find. But Ezra finally knew which direction he needed to travel, not away from his family's legacy, but deeper into it, armed with the truth that had been hidden for too long. The drive back from Kerrville passed in contemplative silence, but Ezra's mind was far from quiet. Questions multiplied with each mile about Gabriel's condition, about the treatments that had separated them, about the 3 years his brother had lived beyond the age in that hidden photograph. By the time they reached the ranch, he'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. "Rosa, I need you to help me find something," he said as they pulled into the circular drive. "Father kept records of everything. There have to be medical files, doctor's reports, something that explains exactly what happened to Gabriel." Rosa looked uncertain. "Your father was very careful about protecting those memories, Mijo. Maybe some things are better left." "No." Ezra's voice carried a firmness that reminded Rosa of his father at that age. "I've spent 40 years living with half a story. Gabriel deserves better than that. I deserve better than that." They began their search in the study, but the file cabinets yielded only ranch business and legal documents. It wasn't until Rosa suggested checking the old safe in the basement that they found what Ezra was looking for. Behind tax records and insurance papers, wrapped in oilcloth similar to the hiding place under the floorboard, was a thick manila folder labeled simply "Medical Private." Inside were typewritten reports from Dr. Marcus Webb, a neurologist in San Antonio, dating from Gabriel's first seizure at age 4 through his final hospitalization following the fire. The clinical language couldn't mask the humanity behind the careful observations. Patient exhibits complex partial seizures with motor involvement. Intelligence remains high despite episodic challenges. Responds well to structured environment and consistent medication schedule. Ezra read every page twice, building a picture of his brother that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Gabriel had indeed suffered from epilepsy, but the condition was manageable with proper medication. The real tragedy wasn't his seizures. It was the isolation that had followed his parents' decision to seek treatment away from home. One report, dated shortly after the separation, painted a particularly painful picture. Patient continues to ask for Ezra daily. Sleep disturbances persist. Recommend family reunification as soon as practical for optimal emotional development. Dr. Webb had been advocating for the twins' reunion, but subsequent reports showed that recommendation being repeatedly postponed. First, the doctors wanted to stabilize Gabriel's medication. Then they wanted to address behavioral issues stemming from the separation anxiety. Each delay created new complications, and by the time Gabriel was deemed ready for reunion, the fire had changed everything. The final medical report was devastating in its clinical precision. Patient suffered second and third degree burns to approximately 30% of his body. Despite initial positive response to treatment, secondary infection has compromised recovery. Prognosis remains guarded. Attached to the medical files was something that made Ezra's breath catch a child's drawing in crayon. Labeled at the bottom in Gabriel's careful handwriting, "Me and Ezra on the ranch." The picture showed two stick figures standing beside what was clearly meant to be a horse, with a house in the background. One figure wore a cowboy hat, the other held what might have been a book. Even at 6, Gabriel had remembered their life together clearly enough to draw it. Rosa found Ezra sitting on the basement steps an hour later, the drawing in his hands and tears on his cheeks. "He never forgot me," Ezra said. "All those years in hospitals and treatment centers, and he never forgot." "Children don't forget love," Rosa said gently. "No matter what the adults around them decide is best." Among the medical papers was another artifact that stopped Ezra cold, a small leather journal in Gabriel's handwriting, apparently kept during his final year. The entries were sporadic and sometimes difficult to read, the handwriting shaky in places where seizures had affected his motor control, but the content revealed a boy of remarkable intelligence and sensitivity. "Mama says we're going home soon. I can't wait to see Ezra and show him the new books I learned to read. Dr. Webb says, my brain works different, but that doesn't make me broken. I think Ezra will understand, because we're twins, and twins always understand each other. Had a bad seizure today. Knocked over the lamp in my room and scared Mama. She cried and held me so tight I could barely breathe. I told her it's okay, that the seizures don't hurt, but grown-ups worry about everything. I wish Ezra was here. He wouldn't be scared. Mama took me to see the horses today at the ranch where we're staying. There was a brown one that reminded me of the horse Ezra and I used to ride. I tried to remember his name but couldn't. It makes me sad when I forget things about before. But I remember Ezra's laugh. I'll always remember that." The final entry, dated just a week before the fire, nearly broke Ezra's heart. "Tomorrow we're going home to Daddy and Ezra. Mama says I'm all better now and we can be a family again. I practice walking without my cane because I want Ezra to see how strong I got. I have so many stories to tell him. I hope he still likes horses." Gabriel had been excited about coming home. He'd been working to improve, to be worthy of reunion. The fire that had changed everything hadn't been the act of a sick child lacking supervision. It had been the accident of an eager boy trying to reconnect with his twin by reading a book in the dark. Ezra carefully closed the journal, understanding now that his father's guilt had been even deeper than he'd imagined. Thaddeus McClintock hadn't just lost his wife and son in that car accident. He'd lost them while they were fleeing the consequences of his own decision to keep the family separated. The judge, who prided himself on wisdom and justice, had made the one choice that had destroyed everything he'd tried to protect. "Rosa," Ezra said finally, "I want to frame Gabriel's drawing. It should be in the study, where Father can—" He stopped, remembering that his father was gone, that there would be no more late-night conversations with the dead in that quiet room. "Where you can see it," Rosa corrected gently. "Your father carried this guilt long enough. It's time someone in this family remembered Gabriel with joy instead of sorrow." As they climbed the basement stairs, Ezra carried the journal carefully, treating it like the treasure it was, the voice of a brother he was finally getting to know. 40 years too late, but not a moment later than when he was ready to hear it. Word traveled fast in ranch country, and by the next morning, Ezra found himself facing a steady stream of visitors, long-time ranch hands, neighbors, and family friends who'd heard about his discovery through the reliable grapevine of rural Texas. They came bearing memories like gifts, each offering pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for 40 years. The first to arrive was Tommy Gutierrez, now pushing 70 but still spry enough to work cattle when his arthritis allowed. Tommy had been barely 20 when he'd started working for Thaddeus McClintock, and his weathered face grew soft with memory as he sat across from Ezra in the kitchen. "I remember them boys like it was yesterday," Tommy said. Accepting the coffee Rosa offered with grateful hands. "Gabriel was quieter than you, but Lord, that child was smart, could add numbers in his head faster than I could with a calculator. And patient, he'd sit for hours watching the cattle, learning their patterns." "You remember Gabriel working with the cattle?" Ezra asked, surprised. The medical reports had painted a picture of a fragile child confined to treatments and therapy. "Oh, he couldn't do the riding and roping like you could," Tommy clarified. "But he had an eye for the animals, could spot a sick calf from 100 yards, tell you which cows were about to calve. Your daddy called him his little ranch manager." The revelation added another layer to Ezra's understanding. Gabriel hadn't just been the sick twin, he'd been an integral part of the ranch's daily operations, contributing in his own unique way before the separation had torn him away from the only life he'd known. Tommy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper, a small wooden carving of a horse, crude but recognizable, with E+G carved into its base. "Gabriel made this for you the Christmas before they took him away. I was supposed to give it to you, but after, well, your daddy said it was better to let sleeping dogs lie." Ezra turned the carved horse over in his hands, feeling the slightly uneven surfaces where a 6-year-old's small hands had worked the wood. Gabriel had made this with love, had probably spent hours perfecting each detail, and it had been hidden away like everything else that connected the brothers. More visitors came throughout the day, each bringing their own fragments of memory. Maria Santos, who'd worked in the ranch house before Rosa, remembered Gabriel's voracious appetite for books and his habit of reading to the barn cats. Old Pete Morrison, the former veterinarian, spoke of Gabriel's intuitive understanding of animal behavior and his dream of becoming a rancher despite his physical challenges. But it was Charlie Brennan who brought the most significant revelation. He arrived just before sunset, hat in hand and eyes heavy, with 40 years of kept secrets. "I should have told you this years ago," Charlie said without preamble, "but your father made me swear." He stopped, gathering courage from some deep well. "Gabriel didn't just survive that fire, Ezra. He thrived after it. Those last few months before the accident, he was the happiest I'd ever seen him." Charlie walked to the window that overlooked the main pasture, his gaze distant with memory. "Your daddy had been planning to bring both boys home that spring. Gabriel's seizures were under control, and the burn scars had healed better than anyone expected. Elizabeth was finally ready to try family life again." "Then why?" Ezra began, but Charlie held up a weathered hand. "Because of this." Charlie reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "It's a letter. Gabriel wrote to you, the week before they came to get him. Elizabeth asked me to deliver it personally, but the letter was written in Gabriel's careful script on ranch letterhead, the words slightly shaky but determined. Dear Ezra, Mama says I can come home soon and we can be real brothers again. I know I'm different now because of the seizures and the fire marks on my arms, but I'm still your twin. I've been practicing walking without my cane so I can keep up with you on the ranch. Dr. Webb says my brain works special, not broken, and maybe that's why I can understand the cattle like I do. I can't wait to show you all the things I learned about taking care of them. We can run the ranch together when we grow up, just like Daddy and his daddy did. I love you, even though I can't remember everything about before. Twins always love each other. Your brother, Gabriel. Ezra's hands shook as he read, and Charlie's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. Elizabeth wanted you to have it before they arrived, so you'd know Gabriel was coming home not as an invalid, but as your partner. She thought if you understood how much he'd grown, how capable he'd become despite his challenges, the reunion would be easier for both boys. But the accident happened before I could read it, Ezra said, the cruel timing of it all overwhelming him. Your father blamed himself for that letter as much as everything else, Charlie said. He kept saying that if Gabriel hadn't been so excited about coming home, if he hadn't been trying to prepare by reading your old books, the fire never would have happened. Charlie pulled out one more item, a child's pocket watch, tarnished with age but still ticking. Gabriel carried this everywhere those last months. Said it would help him keep ranch time like a real cowboy. Elizabeth asked me to give it to you if anything ever happened to him. The watch felt warm in Ezra's palm, its steady tick marking time that Gabriel would never experience. But instead of sadness, Ezra felt something unexpected pride. Gabriel had faced his challenges with courage and determination, had worked to overcome obstacles that would have defeated lesser spirits. He'd been preparing to return not as a burden, but as a contributor, ready to claim his place in the family legacy. Charlie, Ezra said finally, did my father ever talk about what he planned to do with the ranch? I mean, if Gabriel had lived, if they'd both grown up here. Charlie smiled for the first time since arriving. He used to say the ranch was big enough for two different kinds of ranchers, one who could ride and rope, and one who could think and plan. Said together, you boys would make it the finest operation in Texas. As the sun set over McClintock land, Ezra understood that his father's vision hadn't died with Gabriel. It had simply been waiting 40 years for someone to resurrect it. The ranch could still honor both brothers, could still embody the partnership that tragedy had prevented. Gabriel's intelligence and intuition, his love for the land and animals, could live on through choices Ezra made going forward. 3 days later, as Ezra sat in his father's chair reviewing ranch business with renewed purpose, Rosa appeared in the doorway carrying a dusty cardboard box. Her face bore the expression of someone wrestling with a decision she'd been avoiding for years. There's something else, she said quietly, setting the box on the desk. Something I should have given you with the rest. But I wasn't sure you were ready. Ezra looked up from Gabriel's journal, which had become his constant companion. Every spare moment was spent reading his brother's thoughts, trying to bridge 4 decades of separation with the power of written words. What is it, Rosa? Your father's final letter. He wrote it the night before he died. Rosa's hands trembled slightly as she opened the box. He asked me to give it to you only if you ever learned the truth about Gabriel. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper with Ezra James McClintock written in his father's careful script. Inside were several pages, covered in the judge's precise handwriting, but the penmanship was shakier than usual, as if emotion had affected his normally steady hand. My son, the letter began, if you are reading this, then Rosa has judged you ready to know what I never had the courage to tell you while I drew breath. The story you've uncovered is true, but it is not complete. There are depths to this tragedy that I've kept buried, not from shame alone, but from fear of what the whole truth might do to the memory of your brother and your mother. Ezra's pulse quickened. Even in death, his father was parceling out revelations like a careful prosecutor building a case. Gabriel did not die in that car accident, the letter continued. He died 3 days later in the hospital, and I was there when he passed. Your mother, God rest her soul, died instantly when their car hit the oak tree outside Kerrville. But Gabriel survived the crash with only minor injuries. He was conscious when the paramedics arrived, and the first word he spoke was your name. Ezra's hands began to shake. Rosa had told him Gabriel had lived 3 days in the hospital, but she hadn't mentioned that his father had been there. I drove through the night to reach them, driven by guilt and desperation to undo the damage my choices had wrought. When I walked into Gabriel's hospital room, he looked at me with your eyes and said, "Daddy, where's Ezra? I want to go home to Ezra." Those were the last coherent words my son ever spoke. The letter blurred as tears gathered in Ezra's eyes, but he forced himself to keep reading. The doctors said Gabriel's injuries weren't life-threatening, a concussion, some bruises, nothing that couldn't heal. But during his second night in the hospital, he suffered a massive seizure, different from any he'd experienced before. The stress of the accident, combined with missing his medication schedule, had triggered something the doctors called status epilepticus. Brain damage was inevitable. Ezra had to stop reading the clinical terminology, unable to mask the horror of what his father was describing. Gabriel had been saved from the car accident, only to die from the very condition his parents had spent years trying to manage. For 3 days, I sat beside Gabriel's bed while he drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he would whisper your name or ask for his mama. Once he opened his eyes and seemed to see me clearly. He said, "Tell Ezra I waited for him. Tell him the horses miss us both." Then he smiled. "Lord, help me." He smiled at me with the same sweet expression he'd had as a baby, and he was gone. Ezra pushed back from the desk, needing space to breathe. The image of Gabriel dying alone, except for the father who'd caused the separation, was almost unbearable. But there was more. I made arrangements for their burial in Kerrville, wanting them to rest in the place where their journey toward home had ended. But before I left the hospital, a nurse gave me something that Gabriel had been clutching when the paramedics found him, something your mother must have given him during their final moments together. Rosa reached into the box and withdrew a small object wrapped in tissue paper. With reverent care, she unwrapped it to reveal a silver locket, tarnished with age, but still beautiful. Inside was a photograph that made Ezra's breath catch himself, and Gabriel at age 3, arms around each other, both grinning at the camera with identical gap-toothed smiles. "Elizabeth had this locket made after your 3rd birthday," the letter continued. "She wore it always, said it reminded her that no matter what happened with Gabriel's treatments, you boys would always be connected. She must have given it to Gabriel in those final moments, a tangible reminder that he was loved and that his brother was waiting for him somewhere beyond the pain." The locket felt impossibly heavy in Ezra's palm. His mother's final gift to Gabriel had been the assurance that their bond could not be broken by distance, medical treatments, or even death. But his father's letter wasn't finished. "I could have brought you to the hospital, son. You were old enough at 5 to understand death, old enough to say goodbye to your brother. The doctors even suggested it, said children often benefit from closure. But I was a coward. I couldn't bear the thought of you seeing Gabriel that way, couldn't risk the chance that your last memory of him would be of suffering rather than the joy you'd shared as toddlers. So I let him die, believing you didn't care enough to come. I let him go to his grave, thinking his twin brother had forgotten him completely. And then I compounded that sin by ensuring you would never remember him at all." Ezra felt something break inside him, a dam of grief that had been held back by 40 years of artificial forgetting. Gabriel had died thinking himself abandoned, while Ezra had been protected from even knowing he needed to grieve. The treatments that erased your memories were experimental then, controversial even among the doctors who administered them. but I was desperate to spare you the pain that was devouring me. I told myself I was being merciful, but the truth is simpler and more damning. I was being selfish. I couldn't bear to see my surviving son carry the burden of loss that was breaking me apart, piece by piece. Every choice I made after that day was motivated by the guilt of Gabriel's death and the fear of losing you, too. I kept you at arm's length because I was terrified that loving you too much would somehow bring more tragedy to our family. I became the cold, distant father I swore I'd never be, all to protect you from a pain I'd convinced myself you were too young to bear. The final pages of the letter contained his father's plans for the ranch, his hopes that Ezra would find a way to honor both brothers' memory, and his desperate wish for forgiveness from beyond the grave. But it was the postscript that broke Ezra completely. In the box with this letter, you'll find one more thing. Gabriel asked me to give it to you, but I never had the courage while I lived. Perhaps in death, I can finally complete the promise I made to a dying 6-year-old boy who loved his brother more than life itself. Rosa reached into the box one final time, pulling out a small wooden horse, clearly a companion piece to the one Tommy had brought. This one was more carefully carved, with intricate details that spoke of hours of patient work. On the base, in Gabriel's shaky but determined script, were the words, "For Ezra, my twin and best friend always." The horse Gabriel had carved while dying, while believing his brother had abandoned him, while clinging to love despite feeling forgotten. Ezra held it against his chest and wept for the brother he'd lost twice, for the father who'd carried impossible guilt for 4 decades, and for the family that had been shattered by choices made in love and terror. The weight of his father's final revelation settled over Ezra like dust after a cattle drive, heavy, inescapable, and transforming everything it touched. For 2 days, he barely left the study, surrounded by the artifacts of Gabriel's short life and wrestling with a grief that felt both fresh and 40 years overdue. Rosa watched him with the careful attention of someone who'd seen McClintock men grapple with impossible burdens before. She brought meals that went largely untouched and coffee that grew cold, while Ezra stared out at the pastures, trying to reconcile the brother he was learning to love with the tragedy he'd been denied the right to mourn. On the 3rd morning, Charlie Brennan found him sitting on the front porch at dawn, Gabriel's carved horses in his hands and his father's letter spread across his lap. "You look like a man wrestling with the devil himself," Charlie said, settling into the chair beside him. "Maybe I am." Ezra's voice was rough from lack of sleep and too much thinking. "Charlie, did you know about Gabriel surviving the crash, about my father being there when he died?" Charlie was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the kind of careful consideration that came with decades of keeping other people's secrets. "I suspected. Your daddy was different after that trip to the hospital, broken in a way that went deeper than grief. And he started visiting Kerrville every month, instead of just on Gabriel's birthday. You should have told me." "Maybe, but that wasn't my choice to make." Charlie studied Ezra's profile against the morning light. "Question is, what are you going to do with the truth now that you have it?" It was a fair question, and one that had been gnawing at Ezra since reading his father's confession. The ranch sale was supposed to close next week. The development company had already drawn up plans to convert the homestead into a luxury resort, complete with fake Western facades and manufactured authenticity. Everything his family had built over 3 generations would be transformed into a tourist attraction, a hollow shell that bore no resemblance to the place where 2 brothers had once dreamed of working cattle side by side. "I called the real estate company yesterday," Ezra said quietly. "Told them I was withdrawing the ranch from sale." Charlie's expression didn't change, but Ezra caught the slight relaxation in the older man's shoulders. And I don't know what comes next. I spent 40 years running from this place. Charlie, I built a whole life based on being anything except Thaddeus McClintock's son. Now I find out I was running from Gabriel too, from the brother who never stopped believing we'd be reunited. Ezra held up the wooden horse Gabriel had carved while dying. He made this for me while I was 5 years old, playing with toys and forgetting he ever existed. He died thinking I'd abandoned him, and I didn't even know his name. But you know it now, Charlie said firmly. You know his name, his story, his dreams. The question is whether you're going to honor them or spend the rest of your life drowning in guilt that belongs to your father, not you. The words hit home harder than Charlie probably intended. Ezra realized he'd been wrapping himself in his father's guilt like a hair shirt, taking on responsibility for choices made when he was a child with no power to influence events. Gabriel hadn't died because Ezra failed him. Gabriel had died because well-meaning adults made decisions based on fear rather than love. I want to do something, Ezra said suddenly. Something that honors Gabriel's memory properly, not just keeping the ranch that's about me. I want to do something that would have made him proud to call me his brother. Charlie leaned forward, interested. What did you have in mind? Gabriel understood cattle in a way that was almost supernatural, right? Tommy and Pete both said he could spot problems before anyone else saw them coming, and he was fascinated by the animal's behavior, always watching and learning. That's right. Your daddy used to say Gabriel had a gift for reading the herd. Ezra stood up, pacing to the porch railing as an idea began to take shape. What if we created something that combined Gabriel's insights with modern ranch management? A program that teaches other ranchers how to read cattle behavior, how to manage herds more humanely and efficiently. The more he talked, the more excited he became. Gabriel's journals were full of observations about cattle behavior that were decades ahead of their time. Combined with modern veterinary science and sustainable ranching practices, his brother's insights could revolutionize how ranchers approached herd management. The Gabriel McClintock Institute for Sustainable Ranching, Ezra said, testing how it sounded. A place where ranchers could come to learn not just the mechanics of cattle raising, but the art of understanding the animals themselves. Charlie smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Ezra had seen from him since the funeral. Gabriel would have loved that, making his gift part of something bigger than just our ranch. More than that, Ezra continued, his vision expanding. We could offer programs for children with learning differences, kids like Gabriel, who think differently but have unique insights to offer. Show them that being different isn't the same as being broken. The idea felt right, in a way that settling into his father's role never had. This wouldn't be about carrying on tradition unchanged. It would be about transforming the ranch into something that honored both McClintock brothers while serving a purpose Gabriel would have embraced. I'll need help, Ezra admitted. I know business and consulting, but ranching Gabriel was going to be the one who understood that part. You've got 20 years of good men who worked alongside your brother, even if it was only for a short time, Charlie pointed out. Tommy remembers every observation Gabriel made about the cattle. Pete kept notes on Gabriel's insights about animal behavior. Maria saved some of the drawings Gabriel made of the different cattle personalities. As they talked, Rosa appeared with breakfast and a stack of mail that had accumulated over the past few days. Most of it was routine business, but one envelope stood out, thick, cream-colored paper with the letterhead of a law firm Ezra didn't recognize. Inside was a letter from an attorney in San Antonio, along with a key and a safety deposit box number. The accompanying note was brief but significant. Mr. McClintock, I represented your mother's estate following her death in 1983. Per her instructions, this key was to be delivered to either you or your brother Gabriel upon your father's death. Given the circumstances, I trust you will handle the contents appropriately. Ezra stared at the key, another piece of a puzzle that seemed to have no end. His mother had made provisions for both sons, had somehow anticipated that the truth might eventually surface. Whatever was in that safety deposit box had been waiting 40 years for him to claim it. Rosa, he said, holding up the key, how quickly can we get to San Antonio? Today, if you want, she replied, but Ezra, are you sure you're ready for whatever else your mama might have left behind? He thought about Gabriel's journal entries, about the carved horses, about the locket his mother had given to her dying son. Elizabeth McClintock had understood love in a way that transcended the fear and medical decisions that had torn their family apart. Whatever she'd left in that safety deposit box would be another gift of love, another bridge across 40 years of separation. Gabriel waited his whole life to come home to his family, Ezra said, pocketing the key. The least I can do is gather up every piece of him I can find and bring it home where it belongs. As they prepared for the trip to San Antonio, Ezra found himself thinking not about the weight of his father's guilt, but about the lightness of Gabriel's hope. His brother had died, believing in reunion, in family, in the possibility that love could overcome any obstacle. Maybe it was time to prove that Gabriel's faith hadn't been misplaced, that 40 years late was still better than never, and that some promises could be kept even beyond the grave. The carved horse felt warm in his pocket as they drove away from the ranch, heading toward whatever final gift his mother had left for the sons she'd never stopped loving, even in the face of impossible choices and unimaginable loss. The First National Bank of San Antonio occupied a corner building that had weathered decades of Texas heat with the stoic endurance of old money and older secrets. Ezra stood before the safety deposit box area, the small key feeling impossibly heavy in his palm, while a bank officer verified his identification against records that predated his conscious memory. Box 247 was rented by Elizabeth Moreno McClintock in February 1983, the officer explained, her voice professionally neutral despite the obvious drama of a 40-year gap between rental and access. The rental fees have been automatically paid from a trust account all these years. Rosa squeezed Ezra's shoulder as they were led into the private viewing room. "Your mama always thought ahead," she whispered. Even when her heart was breaking, she was still protecting her boys. The safety deposit box was larger than Ezra had expected, and when the bank officer left them alone, he hesitated before lifting the lid. Whatever Elizabeth McClintock had preserved here had survived longer than both her sons' childhoods, longer than her husband's guilt-ridden life, longer than the medical treatments that had scattered their family like leaves in a storm. Inside, wrapped in silk that had somehow retained its deep blue color despite the passing decades, was a leather-bound album. The cover bore two names embossed in gold: Ezra and Gabriel McClintock, the first 3 years. With trembling hands, Ezra opened to the first page. There, in his mother's careful script, was an inscription: "For my precious boys, these memories belong to both of you, no matter what the world tries to take away. Love transcends time, distance, and even death. You will always be twins, always be brothers, always be loved. Mama." February 1983. The photographs that followed painted a picture of a childhood Ezra had been denied the right to remember. Page after page showed two toddlers who were clearly inseparable, sleeping curled together like puppies, sharing toys with the unconscious generosity of true partnership, building elaborate block towers that required 4 small hands to complete. "Look at this," Rosa whispered, pointing to a photo of both boys on horseback together, guided by their father's steady hands. Gabriel's legs were clearly weaker even then, but his face glowed with the same joy that illuminated Ezra's expression. They weren't patient and caregiver, they were partners in adventure. One photograph stopped Ezra completely. It showed the twins on their 3rd birthday, chocolate cake smeared across both faces, but they weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at each other, and Gabriel was whispering something in Ezra's ear that was making both boys dissolve into giggles. The pure love captured in that moment, unguarded, uncomplicated by medical concerns or future tragedies, was almost too beautiful to bear. Beneath the photo album lay another treasure, a manila envelope containing Gabriel's artwork from before the separation. These weren't the careful drawings of a child trying to remember a lost brother. These were the spontaneous creations of a boy documenting his daily life with his twin. Pictures of them feeding chickens together, sleeping in the same bed, riding their tricycles around the ranch house in endless circuits of joy. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was an item that made Ezra's breath catch. A Christmas ornament, clearly homemade, with 2 small handprints pressed into clay and painted in red and green. Ezra and Gabriel, Christmas 1980, was scratched into the back in a child's unsteady letters. "We made these together," Ezra said suddenly, the memory surfacing without warning. "I remember Gabriel's hands were smaller than mine, and he was worried his print wouldn't show up right. Mum helped him press harder." Rosa looked at him sharply. Ezra stopped, startled by the clarity of the recollection. "I remember making this. Gabriel was so careful, wanted everything to be perfect. He said it was for Mum and Dad to remember us by when we grew up and moved away." The memory felt different from the fragmented dreams and half-formed impressions that had haunted his childhood. This was real, solid, untouched by the medical treatments that had tried to erase Gabriel from his mind. Somehow, the act of holding something they'd created together had unlocked what no amount of therapy or time had been able to access. More memories began to surface, triggered by the tangible evidence of their shared life. Gabriel's laugh higher than Ezra's, but infectious enough to start giggling fits that their parents couldn't stop. Gabriel's habit of talking to the barn cats in serious, whispered conversations. The way Gabriel would fall asleep holding Ezra's hand, as if afraid his twin might disappear in the darkness. "He was never just my sick brother," Ezra said, understanding flooding through him. "He was my best friend, my other half. We did everything together because we wanted to, not because adults made us." In the very bottom of the box, underneath everything else, was a sealed letter addressed to both boys in their mother's handwriting. The envelope bore a single instruction: "To be opened together when you're old enough to understand." Ezra held the sealed letter with the reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. The envelope was heavier than it appeared, as if his mother had somehow infused it with the weight of everything she couldn't say while she lived. Rosa sat beside him in the bank's private room, her presence a steady anchor, as he prepared to read words that had been waiting 40 years for both sons to hear them together. "I wish Gabriel was here," Ezra said quietly, his thumb tracing the careful script of their names. "Maybe he is," Rosa replied. "Maybe this is how he finally gets to come home." Ezra opened the envelope carefully, afraid that hurried movements might somehow damage words that felt more precious than any inheritance. Inside were 3 pages covered in his mother's flowing handwriting, dated February 15, 1983, just days before the car accident that would claim both her life and Gabriel's. "My dearest Ezra and Gabriel," the letter began, "if you are reading this together, then the family has found its way back to wholeness despite the storms that separated us. If only one of you survives to read these words, know that you carry your brother's love with you always, and that love makes you complete even in his physical absence." Ezra's throat tightened. His mother had understood even in her final days that love transcended death, and that the bond between twins could not be severed by tragedy or time. "I am writing this letter while watching Gabriel sleep in the hospital bed beside me, his small hand clutching the wooden horse he carved for you, Ezra. Tomorrow we leave this place and drive toward home, toward the reunion I have prayed for every day since we were forced apart. But if something happens to prevent that reunion, I want you both to know the truth about our choices and the love that motivated them. When Gabriel's seizures began, your father and I were terrified. Not of Gabriel's condition, he was still our brilliant, loving boy, but of a world that might not understand or accept his differences. We made the decision to seek treatment away from home, not because we were ashamed of Gabriel, but because we wanted to give him every possible advantage before he faced a world that could be cruel to children who didn't fit its narrow definitions of normal. Ezra paused, understanding finally settling over him like sunrise after a long night. The separation hadn't been about hiding Gabriel away, it had been about arming him with the tools to thrive despite his challenges. The doctors in San Antonio taught Gabriel not just how to manage his seizures, but how to see his different way of thinking as a gift rather than a limitation. They helped him understand that his insights about animals and patterns weren't strange, they were special. Gabriel learned to be proud of who he was, seizures and all. But the greatest lesson Gabriel learned was about love. Despite being apart from you, Ezra, he never stopped believing in your connection. He drew pictures of you every day, told stories about the adventures you would have when he came home, and carved wooden horses with the dedication of a master craftsman. His love for you never wavered, never doubted, never dimmed. And you, Ezra, though the treatments have taken your conscious memories of Gabriel, your heart remembers. I see it in the way you search crowds for a familiar face, in your dreams that make you call out names you don't recognize, in your instinctive gentleness with anything small or fragile. Part of you has always been waiting for Gabriel to come home. Ezra's hands shook as he read, tears making the words blur together. His mother had seen what the doctors and his father had missed, that erasing memories didn't erase love, that the bond between twins ran deeper than conscious thought. If fate has brought only one of you to read this letter, know that you are not incomplete. You are the keeper of both your stories now. Gabriel's gifts, his insight, his gentleness, his unwavering faith in love, live on in you, Ezra. And your courage, your strength, your protective instincts live on in Gabriel's memory. The ranch is big enough for both your dreams. Gabriel sees patterns in the cattle that could revolutionize how we care for them. Ezra has the leadership skills to take those insights to the world. Together, you could build something that honors both your grandfather's legacy and your own unique gifts. But more than any professional success, I want you to remember this. You are loved, completely, unconditionally, eternally loved. The choices your father and I made came from that love, even when they caused pain. The treatments, the separation, the desperate flight toward home, all of it came from love that sometimes made imperfect decisions, but never stopped burning bright. Take care of each other, my precious boys. Hold each other close, forgive each other's imperfections, and remember that love, real love, transcends every barrier this world can construct. With all my love, always and forever, Mama. Ezra folded the letter carefully, understanding finally that his journey toward healing wasn't just about honoring Gabriel's memory. It was about becoming the man who could love with the same fierce devotion his brother had shown, who could build something worthy of the family that had sacrificed everything for love, even when love led them into tragedy. 6 months later, Ezra stood in the same spot where he'd first discovered the loose floorboard, but the study no longer felt like a mausoleum of buried secrets. Sunlight streamed through windows that Rosa insisted on keeping open, and the walls displayed a carefully curated collection of Gabriel's artwork alongside photographs from their shared childhood. The judge's gavel remained on the desk, but now it sat beside Gabriel's carved horses, and the Christmas ornament bearing both their handprints, symbols of justice tempered by love, authority balanced with compassion. The Gabriel McClintock Institute for Sustainable Ranching had become reality faster than Ezra had dared to hope. The first group of ranchers would arrive next week for a program that combined Gabriel's insights about cattle behavior with modern veterinary science and environmental stewardship. Tommy Gutierrez had proven invaluable in translating Gabriel's childhood observations into practical techniques, while Charlie Brennan coordinated with universities to ensure the program met academic standards. But it was the youth component of the institute that filled Ezra with the deepest pride. Children with learning differences, physical challenges, and neurodivergent thinking patterns came to the ranch for week-long programs designed around Gabriel's principle that being different wasn't the same as being broken. They learned to read cattle behavior, to understand the subtle communications between animals, and most importantly, to see their unique perspectives as gifts rather than limitations. The van from Austin just pulled up. Rosa called from the kitchen. "Your first group is here." Ezra walked to the window and watched as 8 children between the ages of 10 and 16 climbed out of the transport van, their faces showing the mixture of excitement and wariness that came with being different in a world that often didn't make room for differences. Among them was a girl in a wheelchair whose medical chart indicated she'd been born with spina bifida, a boy whose autism made direct eye contact challenging but whose mathematical abilities were extraordinary, and a teenager whose cerebral palsy affected his speech but not his remarkable intuition about animal behavior. "Gabriel would have loved this," Ezra said to Rosa, who had come to stand beside him. "He would have been right in the middle of them, teaching them everything he knew about the cattle," she agreed. "That boy never met a creature he couldn't understand." As the children were introduced to the ranch hands and given their first tour of the facilities, Ezra felt Gabriel's presence more strongly than ever. Not as the ghost of tragedy and lost possibility, but as the living spirit of everything the Institute represented, the belief that every mind had value, that differences could be strengths, and that understanding flowed both ways between humans and the animals in their care. That evening, after the children had settled into their dormitory and the ranch had quieted into its familiar nighttime rhythms, Ezra made his way to the cemetery on the hill, where 4 generations of McClintocks were buried. His father's headstone, erected just last month, bore a simple inscription: "Judge Thaddeus McClintock, beloved father, carried love even when he could not show it." Beside it, Ezra had installed a memorial stone for Gabriel and Elizabeth, their bodies still resting in Kerrville but their spirits finally home where they belonged. Gabriel Thomas McClintock and Elizabeth Moreno McClintock, reunited in love, forever part of this land. "I brought you something," Ezra said aloud, placing Gabriel's pocket watch on the memorial stone. The watch still ticked steadily, marking time that Gabriel would never experience, but somehow still blessing with its persistent rhythm. "The first group of kids starts tomorrow. I think you'd like them. They see the world the way you did, differently but clearly." A warm breeze stirred the oak leaves overhead, and Ezra could almost hear Gabriel's voice in the wind, excited about the adventure of teaching other children that their unique perspectives were gifts to be treasured rather than problems to be solved. Walking back toward the house, Ezra saw the lights still burning in several windows of the children's dormitory. Tomorrow, they would begin learning about sustainable ranching practices, about reading animal behavior, about finding confidence in their abilities despite the challenges they faced. But tonight, they were simply children away from home, carrying hopes and fears in equal measure. The judge's gavel caught the lamplight as Ezra entered the study for his nightly review of the next day's program. But now it reminded him not of rigid authority, but of the careful balance required to build something meaningful, the measured consideration that Gabriel had shown in carving his wooden horses, the patient love that Elizabeth had preserved in her photo albums, and the hard-won wisdom that even Thaddeus McClintock had eventually achieved. Too late for his own happiness, but not too late to guide his son toward a different kind of strength. As Ezra reviewed the lesson plans that would introduce tomorrow's group to the gentle art of understanding cattle, he realized that the weight he'd carried for so long had finally shifted. Instead of the burden of inheritance or the guilt of forgotten love, he now carried the responsibility of stewardship for the land, for the animals, for the children who needed to learn that being different was just another way of being extraordinary. Gabriel's carved horse sat within reach, a reminder that love persisted beyond death, beyond memory, beyond every barrier that fear could construct. The ranch would continue, but not as a monument to the past, as a living testament to the truth that some bonds were strong enough to survive any separation, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to love those we still have the chance to save. In the morning, the work would begin again, but tonight, Ezra McClintock finally felt like he was home.